Good afternoon. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Welcome to this session entitled Aligning Science, Society and Policy for the Grand Challenges of Our Times. Mon nom est Martine Lagacé. Je suis professeure et vice-rectrice associée à la promotion et au développement de la recherche à l'Université d'Ottawa. And I will have the pleasure to moderate this session today. Ce sera avec plaisir donc que j'animerai cette discussion qui sera certainement haute en échange d'idées. I would like to first start by congratulating the Institute for Science, Society and Policy for putting in place this session, particularly its director, Dr. Monica Gattinger. L'ISSP est un des 23 centres de recherche à l'Université d'Ottawa et inclut des chercheurs, bien sûr, practitioners and students from multiple faculties and disciplines, both inside and outside University of Ottawa. Comme son nom l'indique, l'Institut a pour mission première d'essayer de comprendre le lien entre la science, la société et la politique publique. Et on peut dire qu'une des forces de l'ISSP, c'est sa nature très interdisciplinaire et sa capacité à mobiliser son savoir. D'ailleurs, je me permets de souligner que l'Université d'Ottawa a récemment complété son grand exercice de planification stratégique de la recherche et la question de l'interdisciplinarité et de la mobilisation des connaissances est au cœur de ce plan. Je ne surprendrai personne en vous disant que la COVID-19 a animé de bien grands débats sociétaux. Elle a mis à l'avant-plan différentes questions sociétales et elle a mis à l'avant-plan l'importance de se questionner sur la conversation, le dialogue entre la science, la politique et la société. The panel today convenes leading scholars at University of Ottawa that have been reflecting on the different major challenges of our time, such as energy and climate, artificial intelligence, public health, and inclusive innovation. Some of the questions that we'll be raising in the next hour will be as follows. How are they mobilizing knowledge to find trusted and effective solutions? What can be applied to other challenges? How can we build on this to secure Canada's prosperity, environmental resilience, health, and social equity? Public, private, and Indigenous leaders will share their perspectives on the issues. Before introducing our 8 guest speakers, I would like to remind you that there will be a Q&A period. So after 35 minutes of discussion with our panelists today, but I would like to invite you right now to start thinking of your question and enter them through using the Q&A function. J'aimerais maintenant vous présenter donc les chercheurs sur ce panel. I will start by our professors at University of Ottawa, Professor Kelly Bronson. Professor Kelly Bronson is Canada Research Chair, Tier 2, in Science and Society, Faculty of Social Science. Professor Monica Etowa, welcome. Professor Etowa, full professor at the Faculty of Health Science, University of Ottawa. Professor Monica Gattinger, Director of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy, and full professor at the School of Political Studies. Professor Jason Millar, Canada Research Chair, Tier 2, in the Ethical Engineering of Robotics and Artificial Intelligence, Faculty of Engineering. And Professor Sandra Schillo, Associate Professor, Telfer School of Management, Inclusive Innovation Research and Engagement Cluster Lead at the ISSP. Our expert commentators, Ginny Flood, incoming chair, Clean Resource Innovation Network, and also past chair of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, welcome. Dr. Bob Walker, senior fellow at the ISSP, University of Ottawa, former chief scientist at DND, and Robert Watts, Vice President, Indigenous Relations, Nuclear Waste Management Organization, and former CEO of the Assembly of First Nations. Welcome. Alors, vous constatez que nous sommes vraiment avec des chercheurs de haut niveau sur les questions de sciences, de politique et de société. So all of our panelists today have extensive experience working on grand challenges at the interface of science, society, and policy, public health, the governance of robotics and AI, energy, and climate change. I'd like to begin this session by asking them about the challenges they've encountered at this interface and the approaches they've developed to help align science, society, and policy imperatives to address these pivotal issues. I'm going to start with Bob Walker and Jason Millar. So both of you have tremendous experience working with scientists and engineers on complex policy issues, and you work on some of the current challenges or limitations in the ways that scientists and engineers interact with society and policy. Bob, you are a scientist and have built a remarkable career around the themes of science advice, research and development, and evidence-informed decision-making, particularly for energy, climate change, and security defense. Here's my questions, I should say, to you today. Are there things scientists need to change in the way they operate and engage to increase the impact and relevance of their work to help society and policymakers address grand challenges of our times?
Bonjour, Martine, and I look forward to today's discussion. I think there are. I expect we would all agree that governments play a crucial role in addressing the grand challenges facing society. And we'd also no doubt agree that national science and technology community has much to offer to governments in helping address these challenges. But how to do so, or perhaps to the point, how to do so better. In my opinion, when we look at the relationship between our federal government and our nation's science and technology community, I'd suggest there are two interrelated perspectives to this relationship. First, the federal government's a funder. It invests in the nation's S&T enterprise, its capability, its capacity. And secondly, the federal government is actually a customer of the community's research, its knowledge, its evidence, its technology, its ideas, its innovations, its advice, its talent. But how does this customer-supplier relationship actually work? Well, it's complicated. As an S&T community, I do fear at times that we too often focus on the first perspective while casting the second in the language of science advice or the science policy interface. And I'd suggest there is need for a more nuanced thinking. To first order, the federal government organizes this machinery around four big portfolios that provide complementary lenses on the public good. There's the economy, the public health and environmental stewardship, there's public safety and national security, and finally the nation's social well-being. All of these portfolios are customers of science and technology, but the customer needs have significant differences. Through the lens of S&T, what are the emerging opportunities for economic prosperity? What are the emerging risks to public health or to the environment, and how can these be mitigated? What are the emerging threats to public safety and national security, and how can these be reduced? What are the systemic barriers to equitable opportunity for Canadians, and how can we do better? Martine, here's the rub. Grand challenges don't make it easy for us by staying in one of these four lanes, and indeed have crosswalks across multiple, if not all, of these lanes. And that, in my opinion, is an important opportunity for increasing the impact and relevance of our S&T. In essence, by considering these multiple perspectives at the same time as we pursue science. And indeed, this is another take on the concept of convergence research that's an important subject, in fact, for the conference this year. Martine, back to you.
Thank you very much, Bob. I'm going to turn to Jason Millar now. Jason, you have degrees in both engineering and philosophy, and your work aims to build bridges between these disciplines and discourses for the governance of robotics and AI, especially in terms of autonomous mobility. Here are my questions to you. How do we get engineers to engage with ethics? And how does learning and thinking about ethics change the products that engineers develop and their relationship with tech users?
Well, thank you, Martine. It's really exciting to be here. It's just a great group of people that we've got on the panel today, and I'm really excited to hear from everybody about this. So the question is, how do I engage with engineers, and how do I get them to think about and engage with ethics? And really, it's just I often talk about this as a sleight of hand. So one of the things, I came across a quote years ago when I was doing my PhD that engineering and doing engineering is just doing ethics by other means. And you know, when we create technologies and put them into the world, we're de facto changing the kind of ethical arrangement in society, and engaging deeply as engineers with ethical questions mediated through our technologies. So I see my job a lot of times is really just to help to get engineers, when I'm teaching them or when I'm interacting with them through workshops or other types of engagements that I do, to understand how deeply connected they already are with these ethical issues. And they're interested in the questions that we raise about ethics. They just don't often see the deep connection to their work that they're doing already. So this really is a challenge of reframing engineering as an ethical pursuit. So, but they don't, engineers often don't come into the room thinking that way. It's not kind of how we're trained as engineers. So, for example, oftentimes I'll hear engineers say things like, well, in thinking about our design, we really want to think about, say, privacy. We want to think about safety. We want to think about the environment. And we also want to think about ethics. And that's always something that's really interested me, because I see ethics as a kind of umbrella term that encompasses things like privacy and safety and environmentalism. And for sure, privacy, safety, environmentalism came out of these ethical movements. And so what I try to do with engineers is help them understand that if you reframe the work and say, look, over the last century or so, engineers have found really creative ways of engaging in thinking about privacy when they do design, thinking about safety when they do design, and thinking about the environment when they do design. That what we're asking to do, engineers to do when they're thinking about ethics in their work is really just to start adding more categories to those types of engineering activities that they're already doing. So they already know how to do ethics. It takes time to develop the techniques for each type of ethical consideration. So if you're thinking about privacy versus safety, you have to think about different types of considerations in your work. But certainly the challenge there is really just to get them to understand that they're already engaged in it, that there are techniques that you can develop over time to branch out into these different areas of ethics. And so now as we think about robotics and AI, we're thinking about things like fairness, accountability, justice, trustworthiness. These are just other things that we're adding to the basket of ethical concerns that we're already engaged in as engineers. And so that, broadens their understanding of who is impacted by their technology and who they need to engage in order to solve some of those problems in society when they're developing their technology.
Très éclairant. Many thanks. Thank you, Jason. I'll turn to Professor Sandra Schillo now. And Sandra, in contrast to Bob and Jason's work, your research and engagement begins from a focus on society's engagement in science and technology using the concept of inclusive innovation. So what is inclusive innovation and why is it needed to address grand challenges? And how do you live inclusiveness in your own research?
Thank you, Martine, so much for these questions, and yes, a wonderful panel to be part of. So you started out by asking what is inclusive innovation. I'm going to say fundamentally, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just involving people from all walks of life in all of the innovation process. That sounds really simple, but if we actually start thinking this through, what it really means, it actually means that we need to do a whole bunch of things differently from how we have done them in the past. And you asked why this is needed to address grand challenges and what's the link between including everybody and addressing societal challenges. Well, the grand challenges are really occurring at the level of society. They even at the planetary level, really. So they're an expression of the kind of challenges that people live, and everybody experiences them quite differently. So in order for us to really address the grand challenges on a global societal level, we're actually going to be better off if we involve everybody in the solutions that we're seeking. So, and part of the reason why I'm focusing on this is that if we think back to technological innovations we've seen in the past, we've got a gazillion examples of wonderful, fabulous technological advances and ideas that look great on paper, and maybe there's exciting prototypes, and then in practice, they actually don't deliver on these expectations. And one key reason for this is that we're actually not thinking of these innovations inclusively enough. We're not thinking of everybody who needs to use it. We're not thinking of all the environments they're going to be used in. So usually we're forgetting some users. We're forgetting some people who will be affected. We're also a lot of the time forgetting that technological innovation or scientific outcomes by themselves actually don't like that's not all that's needed for something to work. So usually for a technological innovation to be successful, we need to make additional changes. So for example, we'll need business innovation, we need logistics innovation, we need supply chain innovations. Sometimes we even need totally new business models. Like, if you think of Uber and Airbnb, for example, I mean, those companies were successful because sure, they had a technological platform, but that was accompanied by a totally new business model. It was accompanied by social changes, like how people interact with transportation has changed. And in many cases, it actually also was accompanied by regulatory changes. So some of what Uber was doing, or Airbnb in some places, was actually outright illegal under bylaws in many places. So there's the whole range of the various types of innovation that when we really think about who will all be involved in innovation and who will have to use it for it to be successful, we actually can see that all these different types have to come together. And the other aspect of the global challenges is that they're not just happening on a technological or even an economic level. When we include everybody in the process, when we start thinking about these global challenges, we're actually coming to the same place that it's not just economics, it's not just technology, and we're seeing this in the pandemic right now, right? We're seeing that health and the economy are intrinsically intertwined. Without a healthy population, we cannot have a healthy economy. Same thing, if we run out of resources on this planet, we also cannot have an economy. So these are intertwined, and I'm quite sure, I'm seeing it all over the place, that when we involve everybody, then we kind of start asking these questions. And for us to involve everybody in the innovation process effectively, just as a heads up before I go on here for too long, we will need to manage innovation differently. We'll need to govern it differently. And if I just quickly may address your last question as to how I live inclusiveness in my own research, I'm going to tell you quite reluctantly, because it's actually not what I was planning to do, or I'm doing things I wasn't planning on doing. And, I'm not sure that I really technically want to, but I see that I need to. So let me give you one example. We had a workshop on Indigenous innovation. Very successful workshop, extremely good feedback. And in the planning stages for this, the panelists kept telling me, yes, we're going to talk about inclusive innovation. There's lots of happening. There's a lot of Indigenous entrepreneurship, innovation, fabulous things happening. And as we talk about this, we have to talk about education. We have to talk about Indigenous inclusion in the education system. And they kept telling me that. So, would I perhaps have incentives to do more research on inclusive innovation that maybe makes it into A journals? Yes, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. But if I really listen, and I think I have to, if I really listen to what these folks were telling me, I actually have to go and see what I personally can do for Indigenous inclusion in the education system. And we're going to start by creating a national Indigenous women's entrepreneurship ecosystem and see that we integrate that into the work at the ISSP and the University of Ottawa.
Thank you very, very much, Sandra Schillo. Très intéressant. I'll turn to Bob Watts, Kelly Bronson, and Josephine Etowa now. For the three of you, your work also actively engages local communities, citizens, and workers to help align science, society, and policy imperatives for public health, for AI and energy, and environmental governance. Bob, you are the VP for Indigenous Relations at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, an organization that's a leader in reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. How does the NWMO think about its relationship with Indigenous communities in the development of Canada's plan for the long-term storage of high-level nuclear waste? And why is reconciliation fundamental to the organization?
Thanks for your great question, Martine. And let me just also echo what a great honor it is to be part of this conference and part of this panel. You know, probably back a few years ago, we would have been talking about Indigenous communities as stakeholders or somebody to reach out to or to engage with or to be required to consult with. And we've taken an approach over the last number of years to really view Indigenous communities as partners, as collaborators, but most significantly, to recognize that Indigenous communities with an Indigenous worldview and Indigenous knowledge have a tremendous contribution to make, not just to our project, but to society more generally. We've been really fortunate in the work that we've done. We have a council of elders and youth that guide us and have instilled with us an ethic in terms of how we reach out to and work with Indigenous communities and the importance of ceremony, decision making and ceremony as a process. Reconciliation really has been the vehicle. Indigenous knowledge is probably the engine, but reconciliation is kind of the vehicle for our work. And we've not just put in place a reconciliation policy, which we have, which we think is really great, but we've put in assessment tools to measure how we're doing reconciliation. We've trained staff in reconciliation. We actually have a third module that we just developed. We've done a baseline of how we are as an organization in terms of manifesting reconciliation. So we've taken this seriously, both for our staff, our contractors that we work with, and the communities that we work with. Reconciliation is, in many ways, our MO, and not just with Indigenous communities, but with non-Indigenous communities as well. We're reaching out to them to say, you know, this partnership that we're looking for between us as a corporation and Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, reconciliation is a foundation for that. And so we're trying to broaden things out and bring everybody that we work with under this umbrella of reconciliation. Thank you, Martine.
Thank you very much, Bob Watts. Josephine, we're going to turn to you to discuss health and healthcare. You study inequity, actually, in health and healthcare and maternal and newborn health. These are very complex issues that sit right at the intersection of science, society, and policy. One of the methodologies that you apply is participatory action research, so participatory design. So how does this methodology allow your research to, same question, align science, society, and policy imperatives for better health outcomes in this specific context?
Thank you, Martine. And again, I want to acknowledge the great panel that you've put in together here, and I'm pleased to be part of this panel. In terms of answering your question, yes, action research, participatory action research is a key tenet of my research program, and it is a partnership approach of working collaboratively with and through groups of people or communities that are affected by a given issue. My area of research, as you've rightly pointed out, is right at health inequities as it affects racialized communities. And we know how the social determinants of health are influenced by a number of factors, both at the systemic level and how that filters down to the individual level. And so this kind of approach really gets at building capacity for communities and individuals to be able to understand their own issues themselves. So it gives voice, community-based participatory research approach or participatory action participatory action research. It's really one way that we not only engage in research, but we do three things. We engage in the investigation itself to collect data. but we also do education. So critical consciousness raising for those people you're working with. It begins to educate people to a level that they feel compelled to do something about the issues they're facing. And what it also does is that education mobilizes people for action. So it does three things: education, investigation, and action. And so for me, engaging in this kind of work, I have seen the way it's work and help the communities I've worked with, the Black community that I've been able to work with over the last decade. I have seen people engage in research and actually just moving on to want to do something else. This year, I was just surprised when one of my research coordinator, actually not one of the graduate students, came to me and said, I want to run for an election. I am actually running for city councilor. And he said, because that's one way we can change the situation. We have to do something. So I've seen a lot of that kind of consciousness raising leading to wanting to be involved, creating an organization, and wanting to take action to change the situation. And so it works in terms of bringing diverse perspective to the table to actually change the situation, to help people understand why certain things are the way they are, and to take ownership of the research itself. It helps you to understand the process, be part of the process from the beginning of the research design to the knowledge translation piece, where you begin to feel the need to take action and do something with the data. I have been involved in a project where the community members actually decided that while the academics were busy presenting papers, they were designing a play that aired in a number of cities, and people actually really could understand. We were surprised as researchers, some of us, at how they took the data and translated it into a play. Another group translated the research findings into a quilt, a traveling quilt that moved from one community to the other. And so that is one way that it impacts on actually policy and decision making.
So it's moving beyond simple research participation. It's beyond giving them a voice. They are fully integrated into the process of research. Thank you for this perspective. Very interesting. Kelly Bronson, your research aims to better integrate community values and non-technical knowledge in policy making for areas including impact assessment, AI, and agriculture. So why is this integration, Kelly, so difficult, so challenging, and at the same time so necessary?
Merci, Martine. I think I'm going to pull on actually quite a few threads that have been addressed by Jason and Sandra and now by Josephine. Maybe I'll start with an answer to the first question, which is about the importance of integrating ground level, I would call it, sometimes through participatory action research. So sometimes I use similar methods to Josephine. But the importance of integrating citizen feedback into technical decisions, either at the design stage, the kind of work that Jason does with technologists, or within policymaking. I'm committed to doing that kind of work. I think it's important because with any technology come gains or wins, but also every new invention, which is something Sandra mentioned, also raises ethical and social justice issues, right? We don't all win equally. And so it's important to anticipate those issues before wide-scale implementation. If we just look at history, history shows us that the issues themselves are not what catches us up. So Sandra kind of mentioned, right, it's not about the technical design per se, but really, it's the social and ethical issues which cause controversy, loss of faith in science and technology, loss of faith in the legitimacy of governing actors and governing institutions. And so, history also shows, and the kind of work that I do aims to use methods like participatory action research or other kinds of stakeholder engagement to work with members of the public to anticipate their concerns, also their technological needs. And really, I think you can kind of separate out, and this sort of repackages some of what my colleagues have said, but doing that kind of taking stock of that feedback, especially of affected communities, and especially of those most made marginal within communities affected by technological development or innovation, it kind of doing that, integrating that feedback really achieves three things. One is somewhat strategic. So it's a bit about trying to anticipate needs and concerns in order to arrive at innovations that achieve social license, but also which stick, which work for a wide variety of people. But there's also the kind of empowerment argument that Josephine made, right? You can engender trust among a variety of different stakeholders, often across ideological spectrum and viewpoint, by just getting them to speak with one another, right, through these research methods. And then the third kind of reason I think that the work is important is because it's the right thing to do. And so, one of the domains in which I work is impact assessment. Environmental and social impact assessment around large development projects, and this also speaks to what Bob Watts mentioned. But in doing community work, say with Indigenous communities, in taking stock of their feedback around development projects, it's not only a legal necessity, right, the duty to consult, but it's also just the right thing to do. Vis-a-vis reconciliation and justice. And so I think there are those three kind of broad reasons why it's important work. And then the first part of your question, why it's difficult, well, it's time consuming. So, you're face-to-face on the ground. It's about relationship building, which takes a lot of time. And actually during COVID-19, it's virtually impossible. Sorry, pardon the pun. It's very difficult to do that virtually. It's also, it requires a lot of listening and facilitating listening across differences, disciplinary, worldviews, interests. And that kind of work can be really challenging, not only time consuming, but also really emotionally difficult. And then also, the last thing I would say is it's really difficult to do the work well. And if that kind of engagement around science and tech and policymaking, technical policymaking is not done well, it can be not only, unhelpful, but actually actively harmful, right? It can lead to accusations of being kind of tokenistic engagement. And so it has to be really well structured, and that is a difficult thing to do.
Merci beaucoup. Kelly Bronson? We'll come back to you in a couple of minutes. Monica and Ginny, I'm now turning to you. Your work focuses in particular on the policy dimension of the Science Society policy interface for energy and climate change in Canada. Ginny, the latter part of your career has been spent in the private sector, working with large corporations with substantial research and development mandates and networking across the private sector on policy and innovation issues. Recently, you've been appointed chair of CRIN, the Clean Resource Innovation Network, whose ambition is to make Canada a global leader in the energy transformation. Why is aligning science, society, and policy fundamental to achieving this goal? And what actions does CRIN take to bring science, society, and policy together? Not sure that we can hear you.
It helps when you take mute off. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question, and it's just a great honor to be with this esteemed panel. I think, when we look at the role that I've been playing, and with CRIN in particular, we know that the energy future of tomorrow is going to be quite different than it is today. And it will include a balance of clean hydrocarbon energy sources as well as renewable energy sources. And so it is important that the policy environment provides the options for that diverse pathways to achieve those desired outcomes. For example, reducing emissions and having a sustainable energy for Canadians, regardless of what sectors we're working in or regardless of the regions. And I think this is important because the right policy actually shapes how we approach this, and it will contribute to our ability to meet our Paris commitments. And it also government's policy also informs public perceptions, public views. And so why is it also important is because as we're going through this, and these are difficult conversations, and somebody who has not been, who moved from the East to Alberta to join the oil and gas sector about 5 years ago, I actually understand the emotions that come when you talk about energy and you talk about some of the energy systems that are in play. But I have to say, being part of the industry for the last 5 years, I really got to understand and see what's happening. And I think why this is important, because it's akin, if we only pick one solution, and it's really akin to putting all of our eggs in one basket. And so if we limit our approaches and the sectors and the policies into singular outcomes, I think that this then limits our ability to actually create the opportunities for that inclusive approach that other panels have talked about. And it really limits our approach of what does a Canadian energy future look like? We should be driving that for Canadians. We're also stronger working together. And so CRIN's approach is really about a Team Canada approach. It's really about how we're being inclusive, we're being broad, and we're being diverse. And CRIN's role really is focused on the diversity and inclusivity across all of the sectors and communities which we work with. So size of organizations, you know, when we look at CRIN, we think of CRIN as an amplifier. And it's in that context where we're bringing in a multitude of different interests that traditionally wouldn't sit at the same tables and talk about innovation and how to create the new future. And you know, when you think about Canada's oil and gas companies, we spend more annually on clean tech innovation and initiatives than most other sectors in the economy. And so providing that strong platform for those energy-related innovations throughout the supply chain. I would say for actions that CRIN has taken, where we've done is we've connected all the nodes within the innovation ecosystem. So uniting oil and gas with academia, governments, investors, incubators, clean tech companies from across Canada, small, medium enterprises, diverse communities, Indigenous communities. And it's all focused on accelerating the research, the development, the deployment, and most importantly, the commercialization of these technologies. And I know that's a mouthful, but it really demonstrates some of the complexity of what's happening. And, you know, I think we all have to realize that it's not just one sector or group of individuals that are going to find these solutions. We need to be open, and we really do need to take this Team Canada approach to think about policy and how it supports that diverse and collaborative efforts, which are very focused on science. So I think this is about how are we all contributing to reducing emissions, and that's what's at stake here. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ginny. Notre dernière panéliste, Monica Gattinger. Monica, you are founding chair of Positive Energy, a research and engagement program at University of Ottawa that aims to strengthen public confidence in energy decision-making. Your work convenes leaders from business, government, civil society, and academia to co-develop research and solutions in an area that's well known for mistrust and polarization. What have you learned from this type of research and engagement, and do you think that the positive energy model is replicable to issues that go beyond climate change and energy?
Great, thanks so much, Martine. I think, you know, and I'll echo some of the previous comments that have been made. In terms of what I've learned, I think I would say it's hard, would be the first thing that I've learned. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of perseverance to do this kind of work, but it is absolutely crucial. It's no secret that energy and environmental decision-making can be divisive in Canada, if not outright polarizing. It involves scientific imperatives, societal imperatives, policy imperatives, and the work that we've been doing through Positive Energy, it started in 2015, and at that time there was really a growing awareness that existing decision-making processes, notably government decision-making processes, weren't really, up to the task in terms of charting the country's energy future in an age of climate change. Government decision-making processes, they can be top-down, they can be not always super inclusive or transparent. They're not always keeping pace with societal and technological changes and the like. They're not always as coordinated as we might like them to be. And I think, many actors, all the way from industry to Indigenous people to community members to environmental NGOs, individual Canadians, were really losing confidence in decision-making processes. And we saw that notably with a lot of controversy around individual energy projects. And so that brings me to the second part of the question, which is it replicable? And I think, for the model to be replicable, I think it really requires, in other policy sectors, a recognition that existing decision-making systems aren't working. They're not necessarily delivering in terms of securing sustainable, durable decisions around whatever the policy sector is. And so, one of the things that we found with our work is that it really required a willingness and requires a willingness on the part of people coming from a variety of different walks of life and sectors and perspectives, a willingness for them to sit down with others, often with people that they see as their adversaries, to identify shared challenges and constructive paths forward. It really is, it's authentic co-production in terms of the research process, and those who've done it know that it takes a lot of time and a lot of trust building. It also requires people being willing to give up some control, right? You need to be willing to give up some control over the outcomes of decisions. It requires being willing to take some leaps of faith, to work with others and to build trust with others. And that kind of work requires very careful convening. That was one of the things that we really focused a lot of, and still do a lot of our efforts on, creating neutral, nonpartisan, cross-partisan spaces, becoming a trusted convener. I often think of the work that we do as choreography, right? So it's not only setting the table, making sure you've kind of got the right way of framing up the questions and the right inputs into the discussions, but also who's at the table. And I think this is where universities can play a really crucial role. But the academic incentive structures, and I suspect my colleagues on this panel would nod their heads to this point, the academic incentive structures don't always reward or recognize this kind of engaged research. I think we're actually very fortunate at the University of Ottawa that it is recognized and supported, but that isn't always the case. So I think, Martine, I'll end it there and look forward to moving into the next part of the discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Monica. Before actually we turn to the next question, I just want to remind participants that they can already start entering their questions, because after that, all of the panelists, we will be taking questions from the virtual audience, if I may use that expression. So my next question is actually addressed to the 8 panelists today. On va aller dans une perspective plus concrète, dans un mode solution. So how can Canada better align science, society, and policy imperatives to secure Canada's prosperity, environmental resilience, health, and social equity? And the question for each of you is, what is one concrete innovation or transformation that has emerged as crucial from the work that you've been conducting over the last years? And I'm going to start with my colleague, Jason Millar.
Thank you, Martine. Yeah, so I think what I'm going to focus on is what I consider to be a really crucial aspect of helping align science and technology with social and ethical concerns. And that's really focusing on empowerment and how empowerment works. And I think there are 3 aspects to empowerment that I'll talk about, but let me just give the backdrop first. And I'm going to try to connect with so many of the comments that have been raised so far, because I think just like there's what I'm seeing is just so many common intersections between the work that we're all doing. So, okay, in my work, what I've noticed over the years as somebody who comes academically mostly from social sciences and humanities, but really working intensely in, with engineers and now trying to get them to take up some of that work, is that when we're dealing with, on the policy side, the policy, ethical, social science, humanities type work that we do on that side of the world, and people tend to think of it this way, is like there's the social sciences and humanities, there's NSERC, there's health, this is how we've kind of divided up research and education in this country, at least, and in other places. But policies can sometimes be framed in terms that are abstract and general. And for those who are not initiated in that language, like oftentimes engineers, computer scientists, technologists, they can be framed in terms that are, like those abstract terms create sort of conceptual and practical barriers for them when it comes to understanding clearly how those concepts and concerns link deeply with the work that they're doing. So when they sit down at their computer to design some piece of technology, it's not immediately obvious what they need to do in order to connect the social and ethical concerns to the day-to-day work that they're doing, right? So this is a lack of empowerment. And so if you want to empower, there are three things that I think are really key and that have emerged in my work and have really started taking center stage. The first thing is developing tools and methods that are very particular to engineering and computer science to help those individuals engage with the kind of policy initiatives or ethical concerns. So that's the first aspect of empowerment. The second is something that Kelly, Josephine, Sanda have all mentioned in their comments, which is the key role of education. So really, not just developing the tools, but really rolling them out in terms of educating people how to use the tools and what it means to use the tools, and how the tools will help empower them in this kind of work. The third thing I'll talk about are the incentive structures, and Monica just addressed that beautifully. I mean, as a researcher, I could write some academic papers and call it a day. I don't really have to worry about the other stuff, but I do because it's something that interests me. I know Sandra mentioned this kind of reluctant engagement with certain aspects, but really these are, what starts off as reluctance, obviously, just becomes a critical aspect of the work that you're doing if you're measuring your success in terms of impact and empowerment, right? So the one thing that I'm doing is, I mentioned I do the research aspect in order to develop tools and techniques that engineers can use to engage with these things. And, for example, I've developed this concept of like ethics settings maps that you can get engineers or computer scientists to think of their technologies in terms of a series of settings, and then you get them to try to design settings that would connect deeply to these ethical issues or policy initiatives, and then start working from those two ends and find the middle ground where you start developing the functions that actually would support those settings and so on and so forth. It's just an example of a tool that I use. And of course, then there's the teaching aspect that I mentioned. And at the University of Ottawa, I'm lucky. I mean, as someone who's trained primarily, as I said, in philosophy, to be able to sit in an engineering faculty as my home, to be kind of welcomed in the community and expected to roll this stuff out as research and as teaching. It's somewhat unique. I think University of Ottawa is doing it very well. And as we move forward, there's a real promise that it will become a core part of the engineering education landscape. So which is a critical piece of empowerment. Finally, and I'll talk about this a little bit more briefly, but it's the incentive structures. So, and there are a couple of different kinds of incentives that I want to focus on. So the first thing is what you'll often find out. Josephine, I apologize. I believe you're a nursing professor, and So I have a long window, through my family into nursing, and one of the things I've learned over the years is in interacting with nursing educators is that, you know, when you're talking about practice professions, it can be it could be very difficult to teach people and really motivate change in the institutions once they get into practice, right? So you can develop the tools, you can do the education, but if when those professionals walk into their professional settings, they are not supported to use those new techniques, those new methods, if the incentives are aligned in such a way that they undermine this new type of empowerment, then you've really lost out on that last mile of empowerment. So for me, that really goes to prompts me to focus on questions around incentives, both at the university, but also in industry. So when I'm dealing with industry, when I'm dealing with regulators, when I'm dealing with policymakers, I try to encourage them to think about how they can, use the policy levers to motivate those types of changes in incentives to really do that last mile of empowerment. So, for example, when you have engineers who are kind of, their companies are focused on getting first to market and dealing with the time pressures of just getting out there, you don't want them to put ethics on the back shelf. You want the incentive structures to be aligned in such a way that maybe being first to market is not the only way that they will end up winning in the long run in the marketplace, so that they have the time to develop these and integrate these techniques into their work that may allow them to show a different kind of innovation, even if it means taking a hit in terms of being first to market or some other incentive that exists currently in the marketplace. I'll leave it at that. I think I've probably gone over time.
I think that Kelly Bronson has something to say in regards to innovation, picking up on Jason's couple of statements, right?
Sure. Thanks, Martine. Yeah. Thinking back to your original question, I just wanted to kind of do a shout out first to the Government of Canada, to University of Ottawa, absolutely, for fostering this kind of convergence, if we're going to call it that, research, but also to Government of Canada. There are already concrete, I think, policy commitments within Canada that we ought to be proud of. And, Jason and I have just wrapped up a project with a really dynamic and forward-looking group at Treasury Board Secretariat, who are working to advance the directive on responsible artificial intelligence. And Canada is a world leader on thinking about inclusivity vis-a-vis AI, and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada has recently rewritten the legislation to make more room for things like social impacts and ethics and reconciliation. And so, I just wanted to sort of say that I think there's already great stuff happening. But maybe I'll pick up on a little thread that Jason mentioned around incentives. I think one concrete thing that could be done within government, I'm going to focus there, is to incentivize, to use public sector funding to incentivize what we might call alternative innovation or science and technology trajectories, those which serve the still small voices, right? The historically marginalized or the made marginal. We all in our academic work, I think, try to work either on the ground or in various capacities to do that. And we get funding, obviously, from the Tri-Council agencies to do that research. But I think there could be a mechanism within government, a more concrete mechanism to fund private sector R&D that goes to serve the kind of marginalized actors. So I'm thinking about some of my work on looking at artificial intelligence and sophisticated computing in agriculture. Currently there's a lot of momentum behind a particular set of emergent or new technologies for food production in terms of artificial intelligence and data-driven agriculture. But what's happening in industry is servicing really only already resource-rich farmers and a particular kind of food system, and small family organic farmers and agroecological farmers who maybe want to engage with the so-called digital revolution in agriculture are not really empowered or enabled to do so. And so, you know, it's industry is really designing tools for those farmers who can pay for their consumers, and that's not really controversial. But it leaves a gap basically in the innovation landscape. People who are disempowered, right, by a technological change. And we've seen, you know, the sort of what happens when whole sectors or sections of society are disempowered through innovation or changes in technology. And so I think one concrete thing government could do is to really throw some money at R&D for alternative innovation trajectories, maybe use the superclusters mechanism to do that. So in the context of, you know, digital agriculture, you could think about what are the innovation needs of these actors in Canada who still make up a large proportion of the Canadian rural landscape. So they're important for social cohesion and the Canadian society. But also we know that small and diverse farms, biologically diverse farms, are really important for making good on our climate commitments. They really help with climate mitigation and food system resilience. So that's one concrete recommendation. Pulling on Jason's notion of incentivizing, you know, government could actively incentivize, the public sector could incentivize innovations that have justice front and center for the made marginal. Thank you.
Josephine, in terms of health and equity, I should say, in terms of health, what comes to mind in terms of a concrete innovation?
I think I would expand on the idea of diversity and inclusion that has been touched on by both Kelly and Jason. Because in public health or in the health discipline, this really maximizes the multiple perspectives that can bear on a particular issue. When you're examining a particular issue, whether it is the inequities that I focus on, you bring in people from multiple disciplines together, and these people would come with their different lenses to look at this issue, whether it's from the upstream level, the etiology of a particular disease, looking at it from that perspective, but also from a sociological perspective. You have psychologists weighing in on the different impact, whether it's mental health, physical health, people looking at that piece. And I think bringing all of these layers together really highlights the social determinants of health. And when we talk about the social determinants of, again, whether it's education, employment, income, housing, you think about all of those things. There are very many disciplines that look at these issues that impact on health. And by looking at it from that end, it helps us to see that when we see somebody show up at the hospital, whether it's with a simple physical condition, wound infection, it helps us to really understand the layers of issues and the social conditions that brings that person to the hospital to look at how policies impact on this. And because we know the social determinants of health is not so much about the physical illness that brings that person in, but the structural factors and the political decisions or policy decisions that impact on the healthcare of some communities. And so bringing that diversity and social inclusion lens is central to actually addressing this issue. And so I want to point again to the whole notion of using participatory action research in engaging people, even in the co-creation of knowledge and co-creation of policies. So when you bring these different people, and also I want to build on the whole idea of incentives. Jason, thank you for bringing in the nursing piece. It's so true. The issues we face when you're talking about frameworks and tools that we develop, like you. One of the innovations of my work is developing knowledge translation tools, but also engaging community with the kind of approach I use to develop best practice models. What are some of the best practice models out there? We bring in people. Last month we spent trying to do this virtually to bring a number of. We have a study right now that is examining the vulnerability around HIV/AIDS in the Black community in Ontario, where Black community represent over a quarter of those living with HIV in Ontario, where they only make up about 5% of the population. We brought in Black men from across the province to do concept mapping using the findings of a study we've just done called We Speak, Black Men Speak, to look at how these findings can be used to develop a best practice model for working with this, and concept mapping software, the group-wide software, really help us to pull that together. But it's one thing to develop those tools and best practice models, and another thing to go into practice settings and actually find policies that support the implementation of that work. And so it's central to have the incentive that as we do this community mobilization and do a meaningful engagement of community to generate tools, that we actually find a fertile environment in practice settings that are supported by policies where this can be implemented. The other piece that I would like to touch on is that just when you think about the benefits that engaging people whose voices have been forgotten or marginalized in policy decisions, to the co-creation of the knowledge, it not only have impact on the tools that you're generating, but it creates people who have changed in terms of their thinking. They can become people who will contribute at different policy tables, and also setting policies that engages these people so that the knowledge they have actually gained can be used in the future. It's another key point that I think we can mobilize, especially those that have been historically marginalized. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josephine. For the purpose of time, I just want to make sure, because lots of questions are coming in, so I'm going to ask the panelists just to make sure they stick to their 2-3 minutes of answers. And I'm going to turn to Bob Watt now. Josephine has just elaborated on the kind of concept of equity. So how does that relate for you to the notion of reconciliation, Bob?
Yeah, that's great. And Josephine, thanks for all those good words, and for others. You know, one of the things I think about in this area is that to the extent that we talk about equity, alignment of society, science, policy, you know, if we don't place an emphasis on Indigenous well-being, Indigenous prosperity, then we just kind of somehow or another we assume as a country that Indigenous poverty is just a Canadian fact. And one of the things that I think that we've witnessed over the last while, and one of my elders about COVID as an educator, and I think COVID is, you know, has showed us these huge cracks in society, whether it's with climate change or others issues. But one of the big issues that I'm seeing is resiliency and prosperity of Indigenous people. And that's being shown to us in a huge way. Whether it's in the ability to be able to deal with a pandemic and crisis, or their ability to lend their expertise and knowledge to everything from science to development more generally. As Indigenous people, I shouldn't talk that broadly, many Indigenous people would say that our resiliency and well-being is directly related to environmental resilience and well-being. And it's really not clear whether or not, you know, as we move forward, whether it's with the IAA or other initiatives, that we're really talking about improving environmental resiliency. We've witnessed, you know, the last 10-year study of Human Development Index, that Indigenous people barely move forward in terms of health outcomes and life outcomes by those measures in the Human Development Index. We have an opportunity to really bring forward Indigenous knowledge in terms of standard setting, in terms of what Josephine talked about, in terms of co-creation and whole knowledge, and bringing that to bear on so many critical issues. The last thing I wanted just to mention, and this is really from an equity point of view, is the equity of the non-human. So much that I end up seeing and witnessing in terms of talking about resiliency or talking about decolonization or talking about reconciliation is really how we look at the earth. And do we think about Mother Earth in terms of her agency and her rights, and how that agency and rights are taken into account in the myriad of decisions that get made every day without acknowledging those rights? And how can we put those rights into action? My thesis, I guess, would be to the extent that we can do that, then we can try to find some equity in terms of the earth, environmental resiliency, and human resiliency. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that Sandra also certainly has a perspective in terms of what concrete innovation or transformation has emerged, Sandra, from your work on inclusive innovation per se.
Yes, well, how to follow Bob here. First of all, I agree. And thank you for this. I'm going to say that I think we need to get smarter at this. You know, if it appears like a fact that Indigenous people are not making progress, then let's challenge that. Let's question some of those facts. Not in the sense that it's not true, but that we need to kind of actually kind of go beyond the reality that we see and actually get smart about what we can envision, how we can envision it. And many of the speakers touched on really important points. So when Monica says that we don't have current decision-making processes that do this, and that we need to learn how to give up control over the outcomes. You know, when Josephine talks about not just the social determinants of health, which is all linked, the health of the human and the planet is all intertwined. But when Josephine points out that we need to have participatory co-creation of knowledge and policy, I think that's really the point that we need to get to. And there are a couple of things I think we need to do to get there. Number one, we need to consider intersectionality. Because actually there are, for example, Indigenous communities that are actually doing really well. There are, on the other hand, white middle-aged males who are not in a good place right now. And if we think of innovation, the things that we are going to do in the future, for example, if we think of autonomous vehicles, there are a lot of drivers out there who are actually worried about losing their jobs in the future through innovation. That's a reality, and that needs to be acknowledged for us to have the meaningful conversation that we need in order to co-create new realities. So I think the first point is we need to get a little bit beyond the labels. We need to obviously be inclusive by demographic groups and by lived realities, but we need to be very cognizant that certain labels alone do not actually make a person. And then once we do that, I think that means that we need to learn to listen more meaningfully, and that we develop mechanisms to listen, mechanisms in policy, mechanisms in governance. And I wish I could actually go and say, here's how we do this, but that would be absolutely the wrong thing, because it needs to be co-creation. Not one of us can say, here's the process for this, here's how we listen to this. The one point I want to make in terms of what we can co-create and how we need to co-create this going forward is, I've heard a lot about equity and diversity in hiring and so on. And I want to make a shout out to Chris McPhee from the AFC Living Lab, who kind of said, we can't hire ourselves out of the mess we're in. It actually, just by hiring people into, let's say, the public service, into universities, that process is A, not fast enough, and B, there are not actually enough people of the right representation to actually have that work. And there's a whole conversation about if we, train people for the positions we want them to be in, by the time they're trained, they think like the people who are in the positions in the first place. So what we need to do, instead of only relying on hiring, of course we need equity in hiring, no doubt about that. But instead of only relying on that, we absolutely have to change our listening mechanisms, our governance mechanism. We need to co-create how we develop policy and governance going forward.
Thank you, Sandra. I'll invite Ginny, Bob, Walker, and Monica to share their perspectives in terms of a concrete innovation.
Yeah, that's great. And I think I'll build a little bit on what Sandra and others have said, but I think one of the things we need to recognize is that the policy development has become increasingly complex. When you think about societal expectations and how quickly they're changing and what they're based on, perceptions that are often garnered through traditional or social media. And in reality, what I see is often what we see is science and data has become a tool that is used to support or oppose a policy direction. And often the debate is centered more around the execution of the policy interpretation, and that really creates a perception of misalignment between the science, society, and policy imperatives. And when we think about that in the context of many climate and environmental policies that we've seen that have been implemented over the last few decades, the policy instruments, the regulations, really need to be thinking about how do you enforce this so that all actions that contribute to the desired outcomes, that government should really be avoiding picking the winners and the losers. They really should be picking kind of what are the outcomes they're looking to achieve. I'll give a little bit of an example. Canadians understand climate change is real. I don't think we need to talk about that. However, opinions on how to achieve those desired outcomes very significantly differ across Canada. So, when you think about provinces that have significant renewable energy, such as hydro, of course, it makes a lot of sense to advocate for electrification, mandated electric vehicles. But if you think about resource-rich provinces, on the other hand, they're also very focused on emission reduction, but their pathways are very different. They're looking at investing in technologies to reduce emissions in traditional types of industries, such as the resource sector, agriculture, mining, or oil and gas. I would say both approaches are correct. I think both approaches are reducing emissions. However, I think when you think about it, the public perceptions and the public acceptability of the approaches are greatly different. And I think this creates the real challenge of this polarizing debate that doesn't allow us to have the real conversation sometimes. And the work that Monica has done with positive energy and that, and bringing the right players. So CRIN is really about trying to bring the right players, that diversity, approaching this very differently. And we're a network of networks that we have over 1,800 members. And I think it's really around how are we changing that conversation. And, the contribution that the Government of Canada just gave us for the $100 million to actually accelerate this innovation in the oil and gas sector is going to go a long way. But it has to be inclusive. It has to be pan-Canadian. It has to be very broad. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you. Thank you, Ginny. Bob Walker?
Yeah, thanks, Martine. I want to thank all of my colleagues here. Wonderful ideas. I'm learning a lot here. And I want to pick up on Ginny's use of the word conversation, because I expect we'd all agree that with this long list of challenges, there's a fact of pressing need for national conversations. Inclusive conversations, the conversations that stand above this all too frequent polarization or echo chambers that seem to constrain such conversations today. These are conversations about where we are as a society today, where we aspire to be tomorrow, what the journey should look like. We're not all going to agree, but the conversations allow us to share perspectives, to listen to alternative views, and to understand where aspirations or transitions may have unintended consequences. So in my mind, there's an important opportunity here for our nation's science and technology community to be a convener, a facilitator of such conversations. But how? Now, I've been personally very encouraged to see that many of our Canadian universities have embraced the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals, talking about a combined suite of grand challenges. That's a platform for both informing new approaches to cross-disciplinary experiential learning in our student populations, and also for providing a unifying set of targets for the impacts of their research enterprises. I really believe that this approach is already stimulating and facilitating new conversations across our campuses. And that these very much mirror what we need nationally. So let's try to find a way to leverage these experiences into even more inclusive conversations, the kind of things we need. And perhaps the place to start is for our S&T community, which is academia, our government's intramural scientists, our private sector scientists, our fourth pillar science-based organizations to come together and have a conversation about such conversations.
Thank you. Thank you. Monica, you have the last word before we get into the questions.
Great. Thank you, Martine. I think one of the implicit questions emerging from this panel is who should take the lead and how when it comes to aligning science, society, and policy. The science community, societal actors, governments, industry, and it's a crucial question. Canada's capacity to transform decision-making to meet grand challenges hinges on an informed answer. There are certainly things the science community and researchers can do and are doing. We've heard a lot about that today. I think industry is also taking steps to change how things are done. Governments are trying as well with greater or lesser degrees of success. And members of society are making their views known increasingly. They're not waiting for action from others. They're taking matters into their own hands, mostly for the positive. I think from my perspective, at the end of the day, what's needed is leadership from all sectors, but it's not just any kind of leadership, it's collaborative leadership. It's leadership that's informed by an ongoing quest to understand, to respect, to be inclusive, and where possible to help to advance others' views and priorities, working across boundaries, disciplines, worldviews, sectors. I don't actually think that sounds easy, and I know it's anything but easy. And I think that's where I want to end, which is that, to my mind, central to transforming decision-making is actually transforming attitudes, habits, and mental maps that many of us have, right? So thinking about humility, thinking about respect, thinking about inclusiveness over, things like commitments to being right, which academics were quite good at being committed to thinking we're right. Commitments to predetermined outcomes, commitments to maintaining control. And in my experience, people tend to be the most open, making those sorts of attitudinal shifts when they come to the realization that the way things are being done just isn't working. It's leading to conflict, it's not getting resolved, it's creating perverse outcomes and the like. So my hope, to end on a positive note, is that panels like these will help to accelerate these processes of realization and help to support the shifts that are needed. People on this panel get it. Canada needs more people like this. That opens the door to transforming decision-making processes. We've heard a lot of examples of that today, and aligning science, society, and policy. And most importantly, this is why we're all coming together here. It holds the keys to opening the doors to meeting the grand challenges of our time. So thanks very much, Martine.
Thank you. What a wonderful way to end this discussion. And we're not over yet. We have a couple of minutes to answer some of the questions. There's lots of questions that were entered. I'm just going to read them and feel free to answer. The first one is reads as follows. A grand challenge to our scientific research is safeguarding or protecting our research. How do we align the Canadian values of open science with the growing concern of foreign interference while balancing international collaboration? Not sure if any of you would like to answer that question. A grand challenge to our scientific research is safeguarding or protecting our research. How do we align the Canadian values of open science with the growing concern of foreign interference while balancing international collaboration? Great question, actually.
Sounds like a good question for Bob.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bob.
Just have my phone ringing in the background here.
It's okay. You don't answer, it's okay.
I did listen in on one of the panels in this conference that was talking to the subject around security of research, and foreign interference in trying to put this forward. To me, it's about making sure that we have a holistic perspective, the issues at play as we try to advance as a society. So my earlier comments in this panel is that when we look at promoting open research and what is in the public good, we have to also come and pragmatically realize there are foreign actors that are looking at taking advantage of our open society to disadvantage the public good in our country. That doesn't mean we have to limit our research. We simply need to do it in a way that is suitably informed by perspectives of opportunity, perspectives of risk, perspectives of threat, and perspectives of equity. I believe we can walk that fine line here, Martine, but the importance is that we have, frankly, a robust and holistic view of the dynamics that are at play in our society.
Thank you. Is there maybe another panelist that would like to follow? Otherwise, we have so many questions. I'm just going to keep going. Next question, maybe to Jason. I'm not sure. Don't want to put you on the spot. New technologies often have unintended societal effects. At what point of the innovation/startup life cycle should those be effects raised as potential red flags? And whose responsibility is it to put a stop to potentially harmful innovation? Public policies usually arrive only after the effects have been deeply felt.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It comes up all the time. So my goal is not to do the impossible, which would be to, make everything that's unintended and unknown known and intended. But certainly we can do better than we do today. So the goal is to make incremental improvements in recognizing the various types of impacts that different technologies can have, and work hard at preventing those. So like I gave an example of 3, environmental safety and privacy, that we haven't solved all the problems in the environment and safety or in privacy, but certainly we're better off than we were when at the time when we didn't consider those an important part of engineering, or we thought, those are somebody else's problem. I can't control for everything. I can, as an engineer, I can do what I do. But no, so the goal really is to make incremental improvements to march down that road and kind of learn and dedicate yourself to understanding what used to be largely unknown and making it less mystified and unpredictable. And I believe we can do that. So that really is how I focus on a lot of the work. But it's a great question. I just would say, yeah, it's not about solving all the problems. It's about making improvements so that we can say that at least we're doing something.
If I could add to that.
Bronson. Go ahead.
Merci, Martine. Yeah, and just to add to what Jason said, I think that it's not only about trying to anticipate the unintended consequences, but acknowledging, well, as Jason said, that there are always unintended consequences, no matter how upstream, sometimes we like to call it, early on in the conceptualization of a particular innovation or at the design stage. If you can try to get designers, right, in conversation with end users or a variety of affected communities or stakeholders, you can do some work to anticipate some of the potential consequences, but there are always consequences. And so for me, my issue is always sort of equity and justice. And the question then becomes consequences for whom, what kinds of consequences, and what are the trade-offs, right? There are always benefits and there are always risks. So the questions are who's going to benefit and who's at risk. And for me, it's, trying to minimize using variety of methods, from stakeholder engagement to technology assessments, to engagement with policymakers and regulators, to try to mitigate the risks for the most marginal. I think the million-dollar question that actually none of us has addressed is, how do you decide who's affected, or how do you decide who's marginal, right? And so I'll just sort of throw that out there.
Thank you. I understand that, Sandra.
If I could even take it further upstream, like obviously what Jason and Kelly are saying is absolutely valid and aligned with the inclusive innovation work. I would even argue, though, that we need to go further upstream. We need to actually have everybody around the table before we even start. And there have to be ongoing conversations at the the starting point of innovation. Sometimes that's in science, so sometimes that's in the research space. Sometimes innovations actually come out of user ideas and so on. So, and what happens if there's an ongoing conversation between communities, and if if we're assuming here for a moment scientifically driven innovations, if the scientists engage on an ongoing basis with user communities, then actually some of these potential impacts will become known much earlier than if we just sit in our labs, do some research, and then try to look for potential consequences. And I think we need, so that's the one point. The other point here is there's a lot of talk these days about a paradigm shift in how we go about doing innovation and in putting it into the marketplace. Right now, we have to show, it has to be proven that something is harmful before we act in terms of a regulatory response. But really, it should be the other way around. We should actually demonstrate that it will not be harmful.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I want to thank all the speakers for a wonderful discussion today. Je pense qu'il y a d'excellentes idées qui ont été partagées pour nourrir ce lien science, société, politique publique. Thank you to members of the audience for your questions, and I hope that this conversation can continue. Don't hesitate to contact ISSP, and thank you again to Monica Gattinger for putting this session in place today. Moi, j'ai appris énormément aussi, so on behalf of University of Ottawa, thank you all. Merci beaucoup. Bonne soirée à tous et bonne conférence.